If you turn to page 835 in your pew Bibles, Jesus has been baptized. He has called his disciples. According to the Gospel of John, he has performed a sign, changing water into wine at the wedding at Cana. And now he goes to his hometown, the town of Nazareth, and that's what we read from the Gospel of Luke, the 4th chapter, beginning at the 16th verse. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. Jesus unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came out of his mouth, but they also said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown, but the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to the widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman, the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of town, and led him to the brow of a hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him over the cliff. But Jesus passed through the midst of them and went on his way. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. There is a scene in the movie The Wedding Crashers, which is the story of two guys who go to weddings uninvited because they know at the reception there'll be beautiful women and maybe they'll be able to meet one. And I don't know how many weddings had happened in their lives prior to the incident, but the two of them are sitting there taking a bet on whether or not the lesson to be read will be from 1 Corinthians 13. They had probably heard it at every wedding they had been at up to that point. We love this section of Paul's writing. We see it in words that are on plaques and on cards, and it's just so poetic that people who come into a worship service where a wedding is being celebrated and see it hardly believe it could come from the Bible. After all, it seems rather relevant, teaching us not just about love, but how to love, how to be a loving person, how love is more than just a second-hand emotion. That was a great song. Don't you just want to get up and be Tina right now? I do, but I won't. Won't go there. The point being, that love as a second-hand emotion is a love that kind of takes its cue from a first-hand emotion. Whenever I see a woman with arms that kind of sag down low, that actually become pillows, I get this warm feeling inside me, and I think Grandma, because I used to cuddle up in those pillows. And she would tell me true stories, and we would get fudgesicles from the ice cream man. When I see that, it's a second-hand emotion. The love that I knew was with my grandma. That was firsthand. And when you hear that song about love being a second-hand emotion, it means that that love triggers something deep, something rooted inside us that we need, that we want to share, that we hope this world could come to understand and live with as a standard. But if we get it only as a second-hand emotion, then we have to go to the source. We have to go to the first-hand emotion. And for Paul, that's Jesus Christ. That's the love of God that is poured out for us in the life of Jesus. Long ago, I heard somebody say, you should test before you are ready to pop the question or say yes. You should test how you feel about that person by inserting that person's name in 1 Corinthians. Susan is patient and kind. Aaron, never arrogant or insisting on his own way. And if you come up and you realize that the person that you have chosen meets that, then you are blessed. Then you know that this God who loves each of us instills that sort of love in us to share with one another. It is not only good, it's in our DNA to be wonderful. Now, I got to tell you about a little confrontation between my friend Rick Thiel and me this week. Rick and I were in my office, and I was referring to the song, and I said, yeah, it was a great song by Tina Turner. And Rick said, Smokey Robinson. Now, I got to tell you, on all things music, I am always going to yield to you, Rick. You are the master when it comes to musical knowledge, but not on this one. I know the song. I sang it. I danced to it too many times. This is Tina Turner. Maybe Smokey wrote it, but Tina sang it. So we went back and forth a few times. I finally had to Google it, and there it was, Tina Turner. Well, Rick actually was thinking of the song, I'll Second That Emotion. Remember that one? Smokey. That was the Smokey Robinson song. And we were both delighted to know we were both right. We were just mistaken about the song and its title and everything else. And Rick left the office, and I was left there almost in a daze. Why was it so important for me to show up, Rick, to be right? Why did I care so much that I just had to Google it and find out it was Tina? And it didn't take me long to realize that in many ways, Rick reminds me of my brother Vic. And growing up with my brother Vic, we were always boxing it out, always trying to get ahead, always trying to be the winner. I don't know that any of you who have siblings are like that. But that's how it was for Vic and me, and I had to go out and tell Rick, you know what just happened here? You remind me of my brother, and I had a win, and I'm glad we both won on this one. But it gets back to the text. When I was a child, I thought like a child. I acted like a child. Hopefully, I haven't taken that kind of secondhand emotion into too many of my relationships as an adult. Hopefully, I am maturing in the kind of love that God gives me in Jesus and calls me to share with one another. You know, when Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians, he was writing to a very affluent culture, a culture that was vying for wealth, power, and wisdom, where people were sure they had it right and wanted control. Kind of sounds like the culture in which we live. Just listen to the debates. Listen to the rhetoric. And ask yourselves, how many of the candidates have ever read 1 Corinthians? But it's not just the candidates who are on public display. It's more often the you and the me who get caught up in that, just as I did with Rick in the office this past week. We want so much to have it our way. We want so much to be right. In fact, we live in a culture that lets us know we should be ashamed if we're not right. It's difficult to be humble and admit we've made mistakes. Jesus goes back home to the town of Nazareth, where he grew up, where people probably knew him as Joseph and Mary's boy, where I believe he probably grew up as any kid and sometimes had to be corrected along the way. I don't think he walked on water. I don't think he had a halo. I don't think everybody was vying to have him on the team because he could knock it out of the park. I think he was truly human. That's a tenet of our faith. And yet Jesus comes back home to say, I have been anointed. I have been chosen to preach good news to the poor, to take God's love and salvation to the world. And some there were offended by that because they kind of liked the control they already had. What might this Jesus be doing to shake it up, make it different? So much so that they drove him out of town. I'm going to ask you a question. The Church Council has asked us to focus this congregation on one thing: growing discipleship. If you're concerned about what that means, growing discipleship means giving up childish ways, aging, maturing, growing into the love that God gives us and God asks us to share. It starts with each and every one of us. But it doesn't end there. Because if we're following the Christ, if we're loving with his love, if we go out into this world, we don't just take the secondhand emotion of love with us. Now we take the firsthand. We take the Christ. We begin to look at our neighbors and we see the Christ. We think of those children in Flint, Michigan, the same way we would think of our own children when we look at a label to make sure they're only getting good nurture in their food. We look at those who are uninsured and in need of health care and want them to have it in the same way we know how important it is should we be rushed to an emergency room later today. That's the first-hand emotion of God living in us, and it's love. Now, we may have different ways of getting there. But if that is our destination, then we have to take each and every action that we do by the words of Paul. And we have to look at Jesus, even as he is driven away by his friends and his neighbors, and say, if I'm going to follow you, it's not always going to make me the most popular. But your will be done, O God, your will be done. Love, more than a second-hand emotion. And God has put it in your heart and mine. Let us go out and proclaim good news. Amen.